I was doing an excavation in Greece on a very small island, Antiparos. And then I had the message that Marija Gimbutas, whose work, of course, I knew, was visiting. And so here was this energetic and enthusiastic lady with a whole series of students in entourage, or so it seems in retrospect. And so she came and looked at the excavation, and she was very enthusiastic, and we hit it off very well. And she may have said generally, oh, would you like to come and teach sometime at UCLA at Los Angeles, where she was based? And I may well have said yes. But anyway, a few months later, a more formal invitation came to go and do a semester's teaching at UCLA, which I did and which I very much enjoyed. And she very kindly accommodated me in her house at Topanga, and she lent me an old car, so I used to drive in every day down to through Topanga Canyon, down to the Pacific, then through Pacific Palisades, up Sunset Boulevard, and so to UCLA. So that was very pleasant, and I saw a lot of Marija then, and we really had an excellent time. Of course, she was always fascinated by the archaeology of Eastern Europe, and I was all set to do an excavation in North Greece, which was going to relate with the cultures of the Balkans. So she suggested that we should do it jointly, and that was a good idea in a number of ways. It was easier to get funding through the National Science Foundation, that's United States funding, so we agreed to do it jointly, and we made it a joint team, and a lot of her students were on the dig. The place was Sitagri in Macedonia, and the whole thing really went very well. Yes, Marija already, and I gathered this in her lectures when I was teaching for her, she had a very clear idea about the origins of the Indo-European languages, which has been a long debate in archaeology, and she was really advocating very strongly and in a new way ideas that had gone back to much earlier times, associated with Gordon Childe and scholars like that. And I'd come to disbelieve those considerably, even before I was aware that Marija was writing about them. And I'm afraid even then she was writing about them, I still disbelieved them, and I indicated this to her, but we got on very well, so that when we were digging things up, she would interpret them, or be inclined to interpret them one way, and I in another way. But when you're doing the digging, the job is to do a good record, to get the material out the ground in a systematic way. So the broader interpretation is not necessarily something you have to do there and then. So we didn't actually disagree in that sense when we were in the field. There's no doubt that that's one of the real pleasures of archaeology, is to be excavating, to be digging, and to be discovering things, as you say, that have not been seen for thousands of years, in this case about 5,000 or 6,000 years, when you find little terracotta figurines, little images where you have incised lines indicating the dress, the costume, and so on. It really is very fascinating. Just the discovery process is fascinating before you even work out what they might mean. It's true that even in the excavation there were some differences. Marija was particularly interested in the figurines because this had a bearing on her view of what she called Old Europe, and she wanted more and more evidence to illustrate Old Europe. So that was her interest, and in the book that we finally produced, the excavation report, she produced the catalogue of the figurines. She wanted to describe that material. I was more interested in the general approach and in the systematics of doing the digging. But I don't think our differences were really so much in excavation technique as the picture you form about the past. And I think Marija from very early on developed a clear picture of how the past must have been, the European past must have been, with her idea of Old Europe, that's in the late Neolithic period, the period of these figurines, up to about 3000 BC, and she saw that as being spoilt and destroyed by the coming of the Indo-Europeans, who she thought were patriarchal, male-oriented, bringing all the disagreeable features of warfare and so on. So this earlier golden age was shattered by the coming of the Indo-Europeans, and for her this golden age was one where female principles operated more strongly, and then in came the male warlike Indo-Europeans. Well, I've always felt that to be an oversimplification, and in addition, when you discuss the origin of the Indo-Europeans, I don't think she, or indeed her predecessors like Child, were getting the story right. So on the occasions we did discuss these things, it was clear we took very different views, and because we got on very well together, personally and in other aspects of work, it didn't seem necessary always to return to those particular issues when it was clear we were going to disagree. We have to start from a slightly different point. The term Indo-European refers to languages, the languages of the Indo-European language family. And it turns out that most of the languages of Europe, French, German, well, just most of the languages of Europe, the Romance languages, the Germanic languages, the Slavonic languages, the Baltic languages, including Lithuanian, Greek, they all belong to the Indo-European language family. They're all related. Very few in Europe don't. Basque doesn't, Hungarian doesn't. So the question for archaeologists has always been, if they're related, which they are, what was the origin of that? How did that come about? And it's generally been felt there must have been a proto-language, Proto-Indo-European. So the question has often been, where was Proto-Indo-European spoken and when was it spoken? And for shorthand, you sometimes call people who speak Indo-European languages Indo-Europeans, and you sometimes call those speaking Proto-Indo-European Proto-Indo-Europeans. But you very soon make the mistake, if you do that, of thinking that everybody speaking an Indo-European language must think the same way. And in fact, the languages are what we understand by the term Indo-European, and a lot of scholars, including Marija, in my view, rather make what I believe to be the mistake of thinking there must be an Indo-European religion or Indo-European way of thought, and one is male, and non-Indo-European would be female or something. I think that gets into very deep waters, and I'm not sure it's sound at all. But I do think it makes sense to say what were the origins of the Indo-European languages, and Marija thought the Indo-European homeland was north of the Black Sea, the area of Russia, the Ukraine, around 3000 BC, and I came to the view that that just wasn't a good argument at all. The idea was that the Indo-Europeans were nomad, warrior, pastoralists, and they domesticated the horse and they came riding into Europe in their masculine way and brought Indo-European culture and Indo-European language. And I just don't think that's right. And my own view is that the Indo-European languages had a much earlier origin, Proto-Indo-European, and there wasn't any warlike invasion or anything. I think Proto-Indo-European came to Europe with the coming of farming, which was a major change. The coming of agriculture. Before that, there were just hunter-gatherers in Europe. And farming, we know, did come to Europe from Anatolia, from what is now Turkey, around 6000 BC. So that's my picture, to simplify, for the coming of Proto-Indo-European, and it isn't all the same as Marija's. We know that agriculture developed, farming developed in the Near East, including Anatolia, where they came to cultivate wheat and barley, and they had sheep and goat and cattle. And once that happened, that culture became a very expansive one, because you can have a much higher population density if you're farming. And so that resulted in a gradual spread of farming across Europe. And those first farmers in Anatolia, in my thinking, were speaking this early language we call Proto-Indo-European, and that's how Proto-Indo-European gradually got spread over most of Europe. Okay. So that's my idea. Right. No people on horses sort of shouting and smiting each other with their battle axes. Well, I think Marija made a number of great contributions. First of all, she was a very enthusiastic person, and she was about the first scholar located in the West after the war really to get involved in the archaeology of Eastern Europe. So she opened that right up and she wrote very scholarly books in that field. Then she got really interested in this area of Southeast Europe which she called Old Europe, which was this wonderful flourishing of culture before the Bronze Age, when they had very well developed villages, when they did a lot of art, produced these figurines, when metallurgy was initiated, and so she really put Old Europe on the map as a coherent concept. And then she developed her ideas about it, and one was that she could really understand the religion of these people from the figurines, and so she wrote a marvelous book called Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe. I once teased her about that when she developed or expressed her rather feminist ideas. I said to her, Maria, you wrote this book, Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe, then the second edition was called Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, and aren't you just being a little politically correct, a little trendy in changing the title? And then she said to me in her very charming way, oh, the first edition was going to be called Goddesses and Gods, but the publishers changed the title around. And so she really just completely destroyed my joke in the nicest way. I was teasing her about catching up with trendy feminism, and on the contrary, in her quiet way, her original book had been called Goddesses and Gods, and just the publishers changed it around. So I thought that was rather nice. Anyway, she then went on to develop these ideas about old Europe having a rather feminine principle and the Indo-Europeans being very patriarchal and so on. And so she got a lot of people interested in that, but I've always thought that oversimplified and not terribly persuasive. In some ways, I think they're all right. If one had the real pleasure of knowing Marija well, then one came to see her as a very likable, energetic, enthusiastic person with great capacities for assimilating information. She came, of course, from her Lithuanian background. She was very much aware that Lithuanian is a Baltic language and therefore an Indo-European language. So she was very much aware that she was an Indo-European. She knew that the mythology and the folk culture in Lithuania was very rich, and that in some ways it may have represented Indo-European mythology and folk culture. So she felt she had a direct line to these things. So she felt to some extent that she could understand it in an intuitive way. I'd almost say a feminine way, but that might be, I might be criticized by some of your more critical viewers, but she had a very holistic approach to things. And that was both a strength, because it led her into new areas with greater enthusiasm and drive. It led her to develop her ideas of old Europe as, and her ideas of the Indo-Europeans as being something very different. So it led her into some interesting directions, but at the same time, I would say critical analysis was not her strength. She was holistic, she was enthusiastic. She didn't say, wait a moment, what would the alternative view be? How would I find evidence that will refute one hypothesis or another hypothesis? She wasn't a rejectionist. As you know, in science, the scientific statement is a statement that is open to refutation. Well, Marija Gimbutas was not a refutationist. She wasn't interested in refutation. She was interested in getting on with the job and getting more understandings. And that led her, I think, into formulations that sometimes were not open to very critical assessment. And if she was criticized, and if maybe something was shown not to be quite right, she wouldn't let that worry her. She'd say, well, never mind, put that aside, get on to the next thing. And that allowed her to be enthusiastic and holistic. That was her contribution. But it did lead her into sometimes simplified expressions, so that I think her view of the feminine qualities of old Europe or of Çatalhöyük or of Malta are now criticized by some more sophisticated feminists because her formulations were not particularly sophisticated in those directions.
Current archaeology is predominantly economic archaeology, a tree stump with no leaves. And I wondered really what you thought about that.
Well, Marija was certainly the whole tree, there's no doubt about that. As I say, she was a very rounded and full person. It is the case that my explanation for the dispersal of Indo-European is rooted in economics. It's rooted in the farming basis, and that may be what she was criticizing. But I've argued myself that cognitive archaeology is very important to try and work on what people thought. But that's not always easy. You do need a very careful methodology. So if I wanted to be critical of Marija, I would say, well, you do have to have a very careful methodology for what you're saying. And Marija's a weakness, perhaps as well as a strength, that she didn't develop an explicit methodology. She didn't say, for instance, with this religion in Southeast Europe she was analyzing, she didn't say, how do we try from archaeological data to work out something about the religion of those far-off days? This is a problem for which we have to develop a methodology. She didn't do that. She just told you what the religion of those days was. And she knew the material so well that that brought a lot of insights. But if you say, now wait a moment, how could she say that? She knew the material well, she gave some impressions, but because the methodology wasn't terribly well developed, not all those insights stand up very well. On the other hand, she was the first person to look at some of that material, and she made observations that are still valid. So that would be my response, really. You need a methodology, and worrying about the methodology wasn't Maria's thing. My own definition of a civilization, I'm not sure it helps particularly, but it is a civilization is a society, broadly speaking a state society, which is quite a complex society, very often urban society with towns, sometimes a society also with writing, as many complex societies have, but it's above all a society that is complex, highly organized, very often a stratified society in the sense that you have kings and nobles and workers and sometimes slaves. So that's broadly what I would call a civilization. I'm not sure that Marija would necessarily identify it very differently, would she? Maybe she would. She spoke of the civilization of old Europe.
That's it.
And that's more the French use of the term. They speak of les civilisations, by which they mean the cultures. They're not necessarily saying it's as complex as a state society. And certainly old Europe, nobody's claiming that there were cities or complete writing system in old Europe. It was a different kind of society. But I think that's mainly a matter of definition. I don't think we've disagreed very profoundly about that. Well, that's right. She perhaps used a different definition. It is true, though, to say that for her, when she used the term the civilization of the goddess, she was wanting to indicate that there was something that was rather good and important that could be identified. And of course there you use the notion of the goddess, which I think is meaningless. I mean, I think that's where her enthusiasm led her first of all to analyze the religion of Southeast Europe in the Copper Age. When you see lots of different representations, you see different representations of women, different representations of men, then she jumped to the conclusion, which is an old conclusion that others reached before her, that all these different representations of women were all the goddess in different guises, in different manifestations. Now, once you get on that, once you insist every time you see a figure in a woman, you say, well, it's the goddess. And if you point out it's very different from that one, well, it's a goddess under a different manifestation. That is no methodology. You can just say, well, everything is a goddess. And indeed, for Marija, in a way, everything became the goddess. The temples of Malta, that's the goddess. Then the megaliths of Western Europe, where you don't have any female representations. It then becomes necessary to take a real leap into the dark and say, well, if you go into one of these megalithic tombs, you're entering through a tunnel and going into an underground burial chamber. Well, let us assume that is the vulva. Let us assume in doing that you're re-entering the womb. Well, if that's the way you look on the world, you're re-entering the womb of the goddess. But if you don't see any goddesses there, and you think you're entering a burial chamber, not a womb, you're in different worlds.
It definitely seems to be a trend.
Certainly so. I think it's true, first of all, that the archaeology of earlier decades made a lot of assumptions, rather assume many of the major initiatives were undertaken by men rather than women. It was, as indeed no doubt society at that time in general was, somewhat sexist and underprivileging the role of women. underprivileging also the role of women archaeologists. And in our discussion, we should not be forgetting that Marija Gimbutas was one of the leading woman archaeologists of our time, of the century, and she also has that place. And that is worth saying, shouldn't need saying, but it does need saying, because women archaeologists have been disadvantaged. In this university, the first woman professor in the University of Cambridge was Dorothy Garrod, and Dorothy Garrod had done the degree course in Cambridge in her younger days, but she hadn't been given a degree, because in those days women weren't given degrees, they were just given a diploma or a certificate. So there were things to rectify, and so that meant that very often the people who were studying or beginning to draw attention to the role of women in the past did have a lot of ground to catch up. They were very much motivated by understandable irritation at the underprivileging of women in the present. Well, Marija never grumbled about that. Marija was not in that sense a feminist, and I don't think she would actually have called herself a feminist very often. She wasn't part of a feminist movement that was seeking women's rights. She was in a quieter way drawing attention to certain things. But it's also true that subsequently archaeologists have gone on to say, we're not really talking about women, we're talking about gender, which is male and female, but also that's an oversimplification of gender. When we're looking at the world today, we mustn't forget gay people and so on, they have to fit into the picture, so that the whole thing is more complicated. And then third wave feminism, as I understand it, is pointing out that really you can't just isolate gender relations, you also have to talk about power relations in society, and the whole thing is much more complicated. So if you're doing quite a complicated social analysis, gender is only one factor. And I think it's fair to say that the debates have moved on a little from the very early feminist debates. But like I say, Marija was never in that sense a feminist. She was very much interested in the role of women, and she was quite willing to ally herself with some of the feminist causes, and I'm sure she felt that the place of women had been an underprivileged one, but I don't think you found her ever writing feminist polemic. She had different things to address. She was really a great lady, and she didn't need to get into that sort of polemic. She had her ideas about the world, particularly the world in the past, which she wished to develop, and that was her field. And if that had implications for contemporary feminism, which it did, well, that's fine, and she was serenely happy with that, but she wasn't sort of jumping on a soapbox and making speeches about it. But really, I just have a very pleasant picture of Marija being enthusiastic about archaeology, being enthusiastic about many other things. That house she had in Topanga was one that she had built up. She had to work very hard for her place. This is one reason I think she was so much respected in Lithuania. When she went back to Lithuania as a very successful, by then, American citizen archaeologist, and so she was a Lithuanian person made good, we have to remember that she really in her lifetime had a hard life. She left Lithuania penniless. She went to Austria and Germany. She came to the United States, worked in Harvard as a research assistant, then wrote her books and so on. So she created her own life in a wonderfully energetic way, and her life, her energies extended to in all kinds of different directions. She built herself a little, acquired and built herself a little house in the Californian desert, as I remember, and she was always very interested in health, and rightly so. Of course, she had ill health in her last days, and she sometimes had back problems. When she was working with us in Greece, she was much troubled by her back. And I remember going on a weekend holiday with her once when she wanted to try all the mud baths and hot springs of the California desert. So we checked out a mud bath here and a mud bath there and so on. And I'm not so into that kind of medicine. I think probably better to go and see a doctor. But she, being a holistic person, had chiropractors working on her back. Then she would go and let's try this mud bath bath, it'll be hotter than that mud bath, and so on. Now, all that sounds amusing, but it was just part of Maria being interested in a wide range of things and really living life to the full. And that's, because I saw her in that way, that's why I still feel very enthusiastic about her and her work, even though I actually disagree, as I've indicated, with some of her main conclusions. We got on very well, we had a good time, and even though, I think because she was such an integrated person, she was saddened in her later years that I didn't agree with her. And that, in a way, prevented her being just as enthusiastic. We were always glad to see each other, but because she was a holistic person, that was always, from then on, something that was lacking in our relationship, that I wasn't fully agreeing with her and supporting her. So it was undoubtedly something a little bit between us. But because she was such a nice person and a good friend, though that was between us a little, it was never anything too big between us, as it were. That's very sweet. So that's very nice. No, she was a lovely lady. There's no doubt about it. She was a lovely lady, and I and my wife Jane were both very fond of her. Delighted when she came to stay. We lived in Sheffield early in our academic career. She came to stay with us once or twice there, and she was really just a great lady. That's a great woman, but I prefer the term. She was a great lady.